We have described the act of becoming conscious as a process of producing symbols, which can then represent other ideas. In the previous episode, this was demonstrated when the period of childhood in which we are relatively unconscious produces the symbolism of the Ouroboros, or of the primordial universe. This symbol can then, by metaphor, extend to other ideas, such as the origins of everything, which satisfies the psyche because it correlates with an actual psychological experience. This is why early creation myths are believed to be genuinely true, because they speak to an inner psychological reality. It is only later in mankind's psychological evolution that we realize that these mythological depictions are not literal descriptions of reality, but psychological descriptions which can be shown to correlate with the phases of the development of consciousness. When we create metaphors, we always start with something that is well known or otherwise feels familiar to us. Archetypes, which we have described as the psychic structures which constitute the template of the human mind, are often projected into the environment to produce new ideas which seem to have some level of familiarity. As Jung writes, human knowledge consists essentially in the constant adaptation of these primordial patterns of ideas that were given to us a priori. The predominant archetypes in the early stages of mankind's symbolic evolution include the instinct to eat, as we have seen in the last video, as well as the archetype of the mother. The mother archetype is a primordial force which is deeply embedded in the mammalian psyche, and for this reason, the idea of the mother finds mythological expression in various mother deities, whose role in mythology is often the same as it is in the development of consciousness at the individual level. The mother archetype predominates the early psychic life of the child, as the child naturally seeks its mother and almost views her as a divine entity, being completely dependent on her. In fact, so close is the child's psychic participation with its mother that the psyche of the child is more like an organ of its mother than its own individual psyche. Because the primordial image of the mother is deeply implanted in the psyche, the idea of the mother finds its way in symbolic meanings, where it comes to elucidate or illuminate similar concepts by way of metaphorical extension. The most well-known and ubiquitous example of this phenomenon is the idea of the earth being a universal mother. The earth is often, although not always, thought of as the mother of all things, from whose primordial womb all life emerges. Just as the mother is the nourisher of children, so the earth is the nourisher for all of humankind. Fertility in women is equated to the fertility of the earth, and we see in early cultures various rituals in the form of sacrifices which are meant to make the earth fertile. As Neumann remarks, the stage of the maternal Ouroboros is characterized by the child's relation to its mother, who yields nourishment, but at the same time it is a historical period in which man's dependence on the earth and nature is at its greatest. The primordial idea of the Earth Mother gives rise to many symbols in myths and religions, which relate the concept of mother to other concepts. Many early rituals were devoted to blood sacrifices to the Earth Mother, such as Thesmophoria, in which pigs were sacrificed and thrown into a pit to make the earth fertile. And the association between blood and the earth probably has to do with the association between menstruation and fertility. The womb of the earth clamors for fertilization, and blood sacrifices and corpses are the food she likes best. In the earliest fertility cults, the gory aspects of the sacrificial victim were handed round as precious gifts and offered up to the earth in order to make her fruitful. These human sacrifices for fertility occur all the world over, quite independently of one another. The great terrestrial law that there can be no life without death was early understood, and still earlier represented in ritual, to mean that the strengthening of life can only be brought about at the cost of sacrificial death. This is why many mother goddesses are also goddesses of agriculture and/or fertility, such as the Greek goddess Demeter or the Hindu goddess Annapurna. Since the mother is so pertinent to early psychological life, the cult of the mother goddess is usually a very early religious idea. However, many myths also portray the mother as a dark and looming force filled with wrath, and who often brings death and destruction. Why is this the case? The answer has to do with the development of ego consciousness. Ego consciousness is that part of ourselves which asserts itself as the master of its own psychological will. But this assertion can be frightful, as the world is a scary place. Detachment from the Ouroboros means being born and descending into the lower world of reality, full of dangers and discomforts. This is completely antithetical to the idea of the mother, whose close embrace provides a source of comfort where we don't need to worry about becoming independent, since the mother supplies us with everything we need. Therefore, ego consciousness depends on becoming independent from the mother, who may otherwise control our wills. Something that is important to remember is that consciousness has an inherently masculine character, and this is true even in women. Although a woman's ego may have a feminine personality, the development of the ego depends upon the masculine portion of the psyche in order to resist the passive feminine side of the maternal Ouroboros. Nature is symbolically described as feminine and graceful, in contrast to consciousness, which often resists nature and instinctual life, which is why it is symbolically masculine. The masculine character of the ego, both in women and men, is represented by the hero in mythology, and the dangerous aspects of the mother over the ego is often represented in the form of devouring mother goddesses or evil witches. We can then see that the mother is often presented in a dual light. She is on the one side a caregiver, healer, nurturer, and a source of comfort and security, but on the other side, she is a terrible and destructive force, which prevents the maturation of the individual and his or her attainment of independence. The overwhelming might of the unconscious, i.e., the devouring, destructive aspect, under which it may also manifest itself, is seen figuratively as the evil mother, whether as the blood-stained goddess of death, plague, famine, flood, and the force of instinct, or as the sweetness that lures to destruction. But as the good mother, she is fullness and abundance, the dispenser of life and happiness, the nutrient earth, the cornucopia of the fruitful womb. She is mankind's instinctive experience of the world's depth and beauty, of the goodness and graciousness of Mother Earth, who daily fulfills the promise of redemption and resurrection, of new life and birth. The ego needs to remove itself from the archetype of the mother, rather than being psychically intertwined with her. Being intertwined with the mother is being wrapped up in the unconscious Ouroboros, since no consciousness is demanded in this state. The terrible, destructive aspect of remaining unconscious finds symbolical expression in mythological mother goddesses. During the phase when consciousness begins to turn into self-consciousness, that is, to recognize and discriminate itself as a separate individual ego, the maternal Ouroboros overshadows it like a dark and tragic fate. Feelings of transitoriness and mortality, impotence and isolation, now color the ego's picture of the Ouroboros, in absolute contrast to the original situation of contentment. The ambivalent character of the mother, in both her positive and negative aspects, can be seen in many Egyptian mother goddesses. Neith, an Egyptian goddess of motherhood and wisdom, is also associated with war. The lion goddess Bastet was a goddess of protection and healing, but her savage nature is reflected in Sekhmet, with whom she was combined into a single deity. Sekhmet is a savage goddess of war. There is also the Syrian mother goddess Astarte, who is both the god of fertility and a goddess of war, and likewise is the Hindu goddess Durga. The mother being associated with unconsciousness and passivity naturally extends to the concept of death, which is the ultimate form of unconsciousness. Behind the archetype of the terrible Earth Mother looms the experience of death, when the Earth takes back her progeny as the dead, divides and dissolves them in order to make herself fruitful. This experience has been preserved in the rites of the terrible Mother, who, in her Earth projection, becomes the flesh-eater, and finally the sarcophagus, the last vestige of man's age-old and long-practiced fertility cults. Thus, the heroic struggle of the ego is also the struggle against death. Death is symbolically characterized as impotence, sterility, and as a failure to face life's challenges, which is why one of the darker aspects of the mother is associated with death, which itself is associated with a passive regression and turning away from consciousness. The mother archetype, being associated with the unconscious, also finds symbolic expression in the many animal mothers, animals being representative of the unconscious instinctual side of life, such as the goat Amalthea, who nurses an infant Zeus, Ödimbla, who nurses an infant frost giant Ymir in Norse mythology, or Hathor, who is often depicted as a cow, which again symbolizes the maternal aspect. Many mother goddesses are also associated with animals, such as the Egyptian fertility goddess Tawaret, who is part hippo, crocodile, and lion. Other animals associated with both the positive and negative aspects of motherhood are the sow and the bear. One theme in mythology, which is wholly relevant to the emerging ego, is that of the dominating or devouring mother, who hangs over the ego incessantly. The mother is represented in a devouring capacity, who prevents the youth from maturing. All these youths, with their weak egos and no personality, only have a collective fate, not a fate of their own. They are not yet individual, and so have no individual existence, only a ritual one. Nor is the mother goddess related to an individual, but only to the youth as an archetypal figure. We have, for instance, the Anatolian mother goddess Cybele, who falls in love with her own son Attis, but when Attis falls in love with the beautiful princess, Cybele afflicts him with madness and he castrates himself. This castration motif is symbolic of the emasculating character of the Great Mother, who commonly brings about madness, which can be interpreted as a forceful return to the unconscious. The Phoenician god Ishmun likewise castrates himself when the goddess Astarte harasses him and drives him to madness. A similar myth of a mother who attempts to prevent her son from maturing is the role of Aphrodite in preventing her son Eros from being with his beloved Psyche. The capacity to return men into a state of unconsciousness can be seen in goddesses who are witches and enchantresses, such as Circe, who has the ability to turn people into animals. The earliest stage is marked by a natural surrender to fate, to the power of the mother or Ouroboros. It is the stage of complete impotence against the Ouroboros mother and the overwhelming power of fate. Masculinity and consciousness have not yet won independence, and Ouroboros incest has given way to the matriarchal incest of adolescence. There are also many witches who play a similar role in preventing maturation, such as Impusa, the daughter of Hecate, who seduces and feeds on young men, and Medusa, whose devouring aspect is quite obvious. The demon queen Rangda in Balinese mythology is a mother of demons, and is said to devour children. Many myths also use the symbol of the spider to represent devouring femininity. The spider can be classified among this group of symbols, not only because it devours the male after coitus, but because it symbolizes the female in general, who spreads her nets for the unwary male. These symbols are meant to capture how the mother archetype wills itself against the emerging ego, and prevents the ego from attaining independence. Occasionally, the hero is able to resist this force, such as when Gilgamesh resists the seduction of the goddess Ishtar, which indicates that a more mature ego can resist the unconscious, although as Erich Neumann remarks, the stronger the masculine ego consciousness becomes, the more it is aware of the emasculating, bewitching, deadly, and stupefying nature of the great goddess. The relationship between Isis and Horus often varies in mythologies, and at times the mother and son come into conflict. In one instance, Horus beheads his mother in order to release himself from her terrible aspect. She grows a new head in the form of a cow, indicating a return to the positive maternal aspect. Not all attempts to resist this influence are successful in myths, as the myth of Hippolytus, who is seduced by his stepmother Phaedra, shows. Hippolytus does not give in to her temptations, but Phaedra curses Hippolytus, who is then dragged and killed by his horses. Hippolytus himself is at the stage of critical resistance to the Great Mother, already conscious of himself as a young man, struggling for autonomy and independence. This is evident from his repudiation of the Great Mother's advances. These mythological sexual advances should not be understood literally, but instead are to be regarded as symbolic descriptions of the psychology of the adolescent. Those flower-like boys are not sufficiently strong to resist and break the power of the Great Mother. They are more pets than lovers. The goddess, full of desire, chooses the boys for herself and rouses their sexuality. The initiative never comes from them. They are always the victims, dying like adorable flowers. The youth has at this stage no masculinity, no consciousness, no higher spiritual ego. This doesn't mean that the mother's or the maternal side of life is inherently dangerous, and the mother archetype is also worshipped throughout the world as a significant primordial force. But mythology frequently presents the situation in this way in order to elevate independence and heroism as the highest ideals. This makes sense, since a tribe needs its members to become competent and independent, rather than childishly dependent on their mothers, especially once adolescence is reached. It is a characteristic fact that the rites of initiation in puberty always begin at this point. Masculine solidarity helps to depotentiate the Great Mother. This is the natural course of the ego, which must overcome passivity in order to feel itself as an autonomous entity. But the mother symbol only appears in a negative capacity insofar as the mother archetype prevents the maturation of the personality. In other contexts, the mother is worshipped and celebrated as a symbol of tenderness, caring, nurturing, and of life itself. She is the goddess of love, having power over the fruitfulness of earth, men, cattle, and crops. She also presides over all birth, and is thus, at one and the same time, goddess of destiny, wisdom, death, and the underworld. Once the adolescent is able to overcome the primordial force of the mother archetype, he or she has gained some measure of autonomy, and the ego can now act with some level of agency. He is no longer a psychic organ of his mother, who may otherwise reduce him to impotency and ineffectiveness. The masculine principle is now strong enough to have reached consciousness of itself. Ego consciousness is no longer the satellite of the maternal Ouroboros, chained to the almighty unconscious, but has become truly independent and capable of standing alone. We can think about all of these symbols in the context of the natural psychological progression of the human mind, which we will examine in a later episode in this series. But we should also note that many forms of neurosis stem from the problem of the Great Mother. The splitting of the Great Mother into a conscious good mother and an unconscious evil one is a basic phenomenon in the psychology of neurosis. The situation, then, is that consciously, the neurotic has a good relation to the mother, but in the gingerbread house of this love, there is hidden the witch, who gobbles up little children and grants them, as a reward, a passive, irresponsible existence without an ego. This is why the stage of the archetypal Great Mother is emphasized as a period in which the ego attempts to overcome the dangerous influences of the mother. However, the mother is only a single primordial force in the psyche of the child. Often, another more authoritarian force is present, which contributes greatly to the development of the ego. In Part 4, we will look at the birth of the ego through the mythological separation of the world parents. Please see the description of this video for more resources which take a deeper look into some of these myths.